First came the backstop, then the protocol. Now we can expect to hear a lot more about the Stormont break, as it is added to the Brexit lexicon. But could the break being hailed by Rishi Sunak in his new Brexit deal and help with getting the resistance down in Northern Ireland? Well, the plan aims to give a future Northern Ireland Assembly a greater say on how EU laws apply to Northern Ireland. That's a key demand of the Democratic Unionist Party before it ended his boycott of power sharing. But why did the UK government introduce this? Under the protocol agreed by the UK and the EU back in 2019, some EU laws on goods and customs apply in Northern Ireland, but politicians at Stormont had no formal way to influence those rules. They, as well as some businesses, had been calling for a wider consultative role, something that had been ruled out under Boris Johnson's administration. The deal then introduced a mechanism to allow elected representatives in the Northern Ireland Assembly to raise an objection to a new goods rule. But how would they do that? It involves a variation of a well-run and at times controversial Stormont tool known as the petition of concern. It's a safeguard procedure agreed as part of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, originally designed to protect the rights of minorities. The break involves a variation of this, and a petition of concern normally requires the signatures of 30 MLAs, so members of the Legislative Assembly, from 2 or more parties, meaning an issue would then be subject to a cross-community vote requiring a majority of unionists and nationalists before it could proceed in the Assembly. But critics said its term over the time effectively amounted to a veto for larger parties, and it was reformed in 2020 to restrict its use. In this case, the government has decided only one part of that process needs to be used by MLAs to flag up their concerns to London about a new EU goods rule coming into effect. So, how would this work? It requires 30 signatures. That threshold allows unionists alone to object to regulations. There are 35 MLAs from unionist parties in the current assembly and 2 independent MLAs who designate as unionist. Once that happens, it goes directly to the Westminster government for consideration, and a cross-community vote is not required. When the UK has intervened, the EU law in question would automatically be suspended within a maximum period of 4 weeks, ahead of further independent arbitration with the EU via the Joint Committee, which oversees the operation of the protocol. The government's command paper states that this provides Stormont with a genuine and powerful role in the decisions about the application of EU laws in Northern Ireland. Crucially, it can only work once there is a fully functioning executive and assembly at Stormont, and that might be why they finally came back. But are there other conditions attached? Yes, while the UK says it is doing this unilaterally to address the democratic deficit caused by the current consent arrangements, the EU has also made clear it views this as an emergency break. It says the measure can only be used in the most exceptional circumstances and as a matter of last resort. The government states the mechanism cannot be used for trivial reasons and that there will need to be a clear demonstration that an EU goods rule being challenged is having a significant impact on everyday life in Northern Ireland. In addition, the government says the burden of proof for that will lie with MLAs to be provided in a detailed and publicly available written explanation. The government expects there to be a consultative process first. And the EU would also be able to counter the move with any remedial action it sees fit, raising the prospect of a potential future standoff. But would Stormont get a vote? Well, that would not be required to trigger the break, but it has been suggested as a possible way of releasing the break. The government says a decision on whether to permanently block an EU rule, once suspended and following discussion in the Joint Committee, would not happen in the absence of a cross-community vote. The process, we will see if it really works and how the legislation is amended in the Northern Ireland Act 1998, legislation that established the current governance structure at Stormont. And there are also additional caveats here. The government says it could still demonstrate exceptional circumstances to justify imposing the new rule, even if a vote at Stormont made clear its opposition. And DUP former Deputy Leader Lord Dodds has been critical of this, saying it means Stormont will not have the final say on such matters. The Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, has now said it will attempt to veto a new EU law applying in Northern Ireland by using this new democratic consent process in the Windsor framework. As I said, the framework is the special Brexit deal which applies to Northern Ireland. That means that Northern Ireland continues to follow some EU laws relating to goods. The framework also provides for these ways for the Stormont Assembly to show if it consents to new or amended EU laws applying in Northern Ireland. And this Stormont break, which relates to updated or amended laws, is there, and it will allow 30 or more MLAs from 2 or more parties to petition the UK government to block this update to EU law from applying. And there's also an applicability motion which concerns the application of a completely new EU law. The DUP has tabled an applicability motion to be debated this week, with the party leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson saying it will be a watershed moment. He explained the legislative process meant the DUP motion had to be brought in the affirmative, meaning it proposes that the law should be applied in Northern Ireland. Didn't happen before I'm filming that, by the way. But he added there should be no doubt about the party's motivation. We will vote decisively against the motion and against the imposition of this EU regulation, is what Donaldson said. A decision by the Assembly to withhold consent for this new EU rule will practically demonstrate that we have removed the democratic deficit within our devolved context. The introduction of new EU laws under the Windsor framework is ultimately a matter for the UK government. However, if the Assembly has not expressed cross-party support for the law via an applicability motion, the government will normally veto it. The veto will not be applied if the government assesses that the new law would not create a new regulatory border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, or if exceptional circumstances apply. If the government vetoes the law, the EU could ultimately take appropriate remedial measures. The DUP motion concerns a new EU law on the protection of geographical indications for craft and industrial products. That means legally defining and protecting certain products which are tied to a geographical area. There are already GI indicators for food and drink. For example, only sparkling wines from a certain area of France can be called champagne. The new law would extend this to cover manufactured goods, such as Italian Murano glass, for example. The UK government analysis of the law suggests that in theory, this could mean some products which are legally marketed in Great Britain could not be moved to Northern Ireland to be sold in the same way. For example, a British product could be labelled as Murano glass and placed on the British market in line with British standards. But if it did not also meet the EU GI definition, then it could not be moved from Britain and placed on the Northern Ireland market unless it were to be relabeled, so as not to indicate itself to be Murano glass, which is a fraud, by the way. However, the government suggests this scenario is unlikely. It said, given that the UK's collective and certification marks offer broadly similar protection to that of a GI scheme, we expect there would be few products marketable in Britain but not in Northern Ireland. In contrast to the UK government, Sir Geoffrey said he believed the law could have serious implications for trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland and could mean new checks at Northern Irish ports. That is not only harmful to our economy, but a threat to the United Kingdom internal market as a whole, he said. But to make that clear, this law would say that it is not allowed to sell something produced in Great Britain in Northern Ireland in the end if it is fraud. Something that is not following the GI but named as such is fraud. If I'm buying, and let's stick to the Murano glass, if I buy Murano glass, which is not cheap, but it's produced in a very, very certain way on the island of Murano, then it's just fraud. You cannot just, it's kind of a Chinese behavior, and that is what Donaldson wants to protect. Seriously. And that is not I have very much faith in the Northern Irish people. So I would say that not being able to buy fraudulent products is not affecting the everyday life of a lot of Northern Irish people. That is my faith in the people of Northern Ireland. But if you want to see something else, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.